Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the pleasure to welcome again Professor Raul Dorantes. He's an activist, a writer, a playwright. Professor Raul Dorantes, thank you very much again for joining me under the Human Rights Tree.
Thank you very much for the invitation, dear Alpha.
It's my pleasure. Today, the reason I invited you under the Human Rights Tree is to talk about the history of Latin America literature. And before we go into the subject, would you mind just describe a little bit the geopolitics of that region? When we talk about Latin America, what are we talking about?
Well, basically, a region that is marked from, let's say, geographically from the Rio Grande that we call Rio Bravo. That river has two names, one for the United States and one for Latin America. And we know it as a Rio Bravo, and here we call it Rio Grande or Rio Grande. And that is the border between Mexico and the United States. And Latin America goes from there all the way to the Tierra del Fuego in Chile and Argentina, to the Magallanes Strait. But to me, personally, I think Latin America has expanded from the Mexico-US border north, further north. Latin America is here in the United States too, because we are talking about 60 million of Latin American origin living in US cities, US towns, and to me that is more than the population of Colombia, the population of Argentina, and we are here. So to me, Latin America is all over. It's all over the culture.
I see. When we talk about Latin America as a region, we have to agree on one thing they have in common. They were all colonized by Spain. So how colonization of Latin America influenced the early production of in the region when it comes to literature? How that colonization affected the region?
Okay, there was literature, let's say what we call pre-colonial literature that was more Aztec, Mayan, Inca, and many groups that had literature before the Spaniards arrived.
Okay.
When they arrived, it was very interesting because there were two kind of men that came from Spain to Latin America. And when we talk Latin America, there we also include the Caribbean and Mexico, Central America, and South America. Two kinds of men, priests and soldiers, religious people and soldiers.
Mm.
And they came with two different reasons, two main reasons. One, to colonize. Second, to Christianize. And it is very interesting because if we know that the first man that came from Spain to Latin America was Christopher Columbus. In Spanish, that name is Cristobal Colón. And Cristobal means the one that brings the Christ. And that was true. He was the first one that came and placed his feet in the new world, and he conducted a mass, a Catholic mass. That was his first act. Now, his name is Cristobal, the one that brings the Christ, and his last name is Colón, the one that colonizes.
Hmm.
So in his name, you can see the destiny of Latin America, at least for 300 years. So they colonize and they Christianize. this land.
I see.
So how does it affect literature, early literature in now the colonial times? These two people, these two men, kind of men, they wrote what we call chronicles of the conquest of the Americas. Priests wrote how they perceived what was happening when they were like committing brutal acts, and of course the soldiers also wrote like their own accounts of the fight. So we have a lot of documents that are considered official documents, but they are full of literary richness. The same Cristobal Colon wrote letters. He wrote letters to the kings of Spain, the king and the queen of Spain, and he made up many things. He said that he had found lakes of gold, spring water, that instead of water there was gold coming out. That was not true, but he wanted to prove that he had found the rich land. But right now we read those documents in literary anthologies.
Mm.
So
So,
yes, tell
so,
me.
so as you indicated, before even the Spanish came, there was kind of already a literature, um, and from the Inca and other indigenous tribes. That kind of literature, was it in writing or in oral?
It was basically oral, but they had their own methodology, and that was called codex. There were codices, like but those codices we cannot say that um, they were not used to read as we now read in Spanish or English or any. They help to keep the memory alive, to memorize. In the process of remembering, I would have a diagram or a drawing there that is going to help me to keep the story. When did it happen? What year? I have one copy here. If you want, I can show it to you so you
Mm,
can see it, like how I can tell you this happened in the spring, and it was the emperor of the Aztecs that came to this land, and that would help them, like children that are like making drawings, and that helps them to keep the memory activated.
I see. So when as you emphasize that when the Spanish came, there were two categories of people. There was the soldiers and there was the priests, who had the chance to write about their journey on their own perspective. What was the major narrative they display? Was it contradictory or was it similar? And
No,
how they shape their narrative when you come to the people they found and the cultures in the region?
yeah, they wanted to justify basically the soldiers that came to justify their right to be here. So we own this land because we discovered it. That's the term that they use, and they
Mm,
had to find a legal narrative to justify that it belonged to them. But the priests, as I told you, they came for a very different reason. And I think the priests were key to establish a big debate among the Spaniards. They say, okay, if you conquer them, if you kill them, even before they are baptized and Christianized, you are going to hell. You,
okay,
okay, because you are killing people. So the soldiers responded, but are they really people? Or they are like any other animal? Look at them. okay, how they live, because everything was different. So the big center of that debate was about the soul. Do the indigenous people have a soul or not? And so the priests, especially the most important one, there were many that wrote and participated in this debate, but Fray Bartolomé de las Casas was key to give the argument that the indigenous people had a soul. And so if you kill somebody that has a soul, you are going to go to hell, you Spaniard soldier. So, and there were people that who supported the idea that the indigenous people didn't have a soul. So there were like actual debates that took place, and there was a lot of writing about it. So finally, there was like a jury about that debate in Spain. Fray Bartolomé de las Casas went there from Mexico, went there to defend his position, and there was a philosopher that didn't come to the New World, but he read a lot about what the soldiers had written about the indigenous people, and they faced each other in front of a jury, and Fray Bartolomé de las Casas won the debate. So the indigenous people have a soul. Okay? So that was very important. And there are many kinds of writing about the tradition, about the customs, about mythology, and about what food, about practices, daily practices of the society. We can say that there are anthropological works, that there are historical pieces, and many kinds, but the most political ones is about the soul. About the soul.
I see. Eventually, there was the period of colonial period, and after that, there were voices emerging for the struggle of independence. How the struggle of independence affected the authors at that time, and what the role they play for that in that movement.
Well, before we get to the independence, because let's say about from 1492 that Christopher Columbus came,
Okay.
and then came to the Caribbean, to what is now Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, okay, and then they moved, not Christopher Columbus, but new Spaniards moved to the continental New World, to Mexico, basically, to Mexico. And that happened in 1519. So 2 years later, the Aztec Empire imploded, boom, because there were a situation. So from 1521 to 1821, those are 300 years. And that's what we call the colonial period of America. We were under the rule of Spain, 300 years. And to know what happened in those 300 years is very important. There was a lot of brutal, terrible situations, but at the end, the positive thing about those 300 years is that we mix. We share not only culture, not only the town we created, we produced, but we mix Africans that came to the Americas, the indigenous people, and the Spaniards that came. Because the big difference with the United States, let's say, because those were like Northern Europeans that came 100 years later, and the Spanish conquerors, is that interracial marriages was allowed in Latin America. That is a big difference. So I can be the slave, but we have a relationship and I become the wife or I become the husband of an indigenous person or an African slave that came. So, and then we have children and we start mixing. And it took place during those 300 years. That doesn't mean that there was no racism. No, there was racism. There was discrimination. There were horrible things. But there was a caste system based on the color of your skin, basically. Yeah, because there were many layers, many layers. So, what happened? You are asking during the independence in terms of literature. I would say we are now talking about the 19th century, 1821. So we got independence from Spain. We are in the early years of the 19th century, and there was a debate also. What kind of a country do we want to build, to establish? And the same question was made by the writers, politicians, intellectuals in Argentina, in Peru, in Mexico. Only two countries didn't achieve independence by 1821. Only two countries in Latin America, Cuba and Puerto Rico. But all the others by 1821 were independent. And that debate that took place was, do we want civilization or do we want barbarism here? Barbarism or civilization? I don't know if it is clear. So what is the answer? All of them say civilization. And then there was a trap there. Because how do you define civilization? And many writers define it as being like Europe. But not like Spain, because we have achieved independence from them. We don't want them now. Let's be like France. So we started copying, imitating models that didn't correspond to the reality of Colombia, to the reality of Peru, to the reality of Argentina. We had a very different reality that we couldn't bring just the reality to France. So they say, if you want to be civilized, learn French. Build your city like Paris, and recreate France in this new land. And I think that was one of the mistakes that were made in the 19th century. There were, to me, a few people that were more clear and with their feet on the reality of the Americas. One of them was Simón Bolívar from Venezuela and José Martí from Cuba. They said, no, we shouldn't imitate anybody. Let's understand this situation. Maybe you don't like it, but this is us. This is us. Our wine may not be as tasty as the French or Italian wine, but it is our wine. Okay? So that was very important.
So it was like a goal to self identification. Despite the movement wanted to imitate, there was a few people who think you should reflect the reality. And the reality in Latin America is, when it comes to society, is quite diverse. I feel like cultures from African descent, indigenous, European descent were able to be together and blend. You emphasize it through marriages, thing change. So how that diversity were able to affect the Latin American literature?
Yes, how does it affect well, we were like creating or facing a new situation, and of course the writers were very involved in politics, and the first I would say that many poems were written during the colonial times. There was poetry in the 19th century too. There was a first short story. We were like very good at writing short stories today, from the 19th century to this day. And those were like more like to narrate, to tell the traditions that were taking place in Lima, in Mexico City, in Buenos Aires. And we published for the first time a novel in right after the independence. It was written and published in Mexico, and it's called El Periquillo Sarmiento. And in El Periquillo Sarmiento, it is more like a satire, but it tells a lot about the daily life of small towns around Mexico City. So
mm,
Mexico City is not what we know today. It was a small city, but and there were many towns. And the writer just described what is happening. Somebody pretended to be a doctor. He bought a certificate of a doctor, but he wasn't a doctor. And he was cheating on people in this small town. And so we got to know the life of those towns. So remember, the people who wrote during the colonial time, maybe it was more like writing about about these dynamics that were always happening during the colonial times, and now we were facing a new situation. So by the mid 19th century is when there was more short stories being published, and then many political writings, and I would say writers became key in participating in the fight between on the struggle or the between conservatism and liberalism.
mm.
Liberalism and conservative points of view. I don't know if I should mention, like in the case of Mexico, because we elected a president for the first time, an indigenous president in 1860, something like that, 1855, 18, and his name was Benito Juarez, and he was full 100% indigenous from Oaxaca, and he was the champions to bring the institution that could work. So the executive branch was working finally, the judicial, and he was surrounded. His ministers were writers. His ministers were people who were very involved in the arts, intellectual people.
I see. As we know, the Latin American literature went through different periods. We can call movement from the Modernismo to the boom and the after boom. You indicated, can you just take us to those different periods and tell us what were the characteristic of Modernismo? And you also name the influence of poetry in that region. And when you come to poetry, can you after that talk a little bit about Rubén Darío, who
Yes. So, yeah, tell me.
who embody the modernism period?
Yes. So I mentioned before that we achieved independence by 1821 from Spain.
Mm,
And in terms of literature, we were somehow imitating the movements, European movements in the
mm,
previous centuries. Let's say Baroque. We had very good writers, especially a woman, Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, during the colonial times, Baroque style.
mm,
It came originally from Italy, Spain, and then Latin America.
mm,
Then in the 18th century, neoclassicism that was coined in France, it moved from France to Spain, and then it landed in Latin America because there were people that were bringing books, and that was very good for theater, neoclassicism.
mm,
Neoclassicism, we had romanticism that was originally a movement from Germany, that region of what is now Germany, moved to Spain, moved to Latin America, and then we had Romanticism in Latin America. Very good writers, but we were somehow imitating the styles of Europe. And in the 19th century, the first literary movement that was coined in Latin in the Spanish speaking world happened in Mexico, Central America, Cuba, and South America. And that's what you mentioned, modernism. Modernismo is, let's say, the first movement that goes from the New World to Spain. Now we're talking about 1860, like the mid of the 19th century. And there are two main writers, but there was a big group in each country of modernistas. Okay? By that time, we had the press, printing press in Latin America. There were newspapers. They would write in newspapers articles, but they were also magnificent poets, magnificent short story writers. And yes, there were two. Rubén Darío from Nicaragua and José Martí from Cuba. The same guy that I mentioned before and who led the independence of the movement of independence in Cuba by 1898. That's when he participated in that struggle. And he was an amazing poet, an amazing essay writer, José Martí. The most famous song in Cuba, Guantanamera, was written by José Martí. Guantanamera, Guantanamera. And there are many poems that we learn when we grow up and when we go to school, because he dedicated one of his books to children, and those poems are taught in the elementary school. The other great poet was Rubén Darío, and probably the most important one, Rubén Darío. So, what elements does it have? Modernismo, I would say that this is very symbolic. There is a lot of symbolism. For example, the cisne, how the blue color is very, they use a lot, they mention blue, they mention swamps as a symbol of beauty, swamp. And also the eagle as a symbol of imperialism. The United States was emerging as the new superpower in that time. And they see, every time that they mention an eagle, the eagle that is coming after you, that was the United States. So, and also they use myths, a lot of myths, not only myths of Latin American or African, of our African and indigenous roots, but also myths from Japan, from India, from China. So exoticism was very important in Modernismo, to explore myths and the life of writers, the bohemian life, and and it is very musical. When you read poems written in the Modernismo, they are like songs, very musical, very musical. I love poems written by modernistas, and I like what I remember of the short stories of modernistas. Very mystical, very mystical. They are exploring. It was new to hear about Buddhism, to hear about Hinduism, about the religions in Japan, and they brought that because maybe to them it was something exotic, but there is some kind of mysticism in their short stories of these poets. So yes, Rubén Darío, he died very early. I think he was 43. He traveled to Chile, he traveled to Argentina, Spain, and he died at an early age in Nicaragua.
I see. There was a period when you come to Latin America literature, they call the boom of Latin. What was the characteristic of that boom, and what was the period, and who were the author that symbolized that boom?
Well, when we talk about the modernism, that's the middle and the end of the 19th century, and people kept writing with the style of the modernistas, and by the early 1930s, there was a poem, very famous poem, that let's twist the neck of the swan. Let's twist the neck. Okay, let's kill it because we keep writing as modernistas. Please, no more, no more anymore. So there was another period that was more like what we call the avant-garde,
Okay.
and yeah, there were many like Cubism, Surrealism that came from Europe. Cubism, Surrealism, Expressionism, and we had our own Cubistas, our own Surrealist painters, not only writers but painters and sculptures, and but there were avant-garde movements that were coined in Latin America, like in Chile creacionismo. There was one guy that says the writer has to believe that he is a small god and he is creating the universe in his own poem. So if he doesn't believe he is not a creationist, so they have their own manifestos and their own groups of writers that believe in that manifesto. And also, very important before we get to the boom, from 1910 to 1920, we had the Mexican Revolution. And it was a very, very, very important historic period because not only because of the political aspect, but also in terms of literature, because many novels were written during the war and after the war, telling what happened in such battle, what happened with this general, with Zapata, with Villa. And so that gave us an idea that we should write about our own political events. So to discover ourselves. So after that, after the Mexican Revolution, there was the first Mexican president after the revolution. He invited a writer to be the head of the education department in Mexico, and he did something very clever. He invited the most important painters in Mexico, the most important writers, to work for the government. Let's say the painters, Diego Rivera, Orozco, the muralists. And what did they paint? What did they paint? They painted Mexican people. It was the first time that Mexicans were painted in a painting because before the models were basically Europeans. And that was very revolutionary to have a woman that goes to the market to sell flowers and to paint that person, to paint that character, to paint a peasant from Oaxaca or whatever. And that was an impact in all over Latin America. So we should look at ourselves in terms of the art. Okay, we just like the Mexican muralists did, we should do it with literature. So now we get to 1959. That is the victory of the Cuban Revolution. January 1st, 1959. And then the boom comes to life. So there were writers already, amazing writers, before the Cuban Revolution, but with the Cuban Revolution, it triggered the importance of those writers in the world. People in Russia, people in Italy, people in the United States wanted to know what is Latin America in terms of, do they write? What do they write about? So, because because everybody was talking about Fidel Castro and about the Cuban Revolution, about socialism 90 miles away from Florida. So in that moment, there are writers, narrators, novelists that started publishing, and they sold a lot of copies. They were selling copies.
Mm.
To me, it is a coincidence. Well, maybe but they were writing already, but now they were like very important in terms of worldwide literature. And to me, there are four writers that I should mention. There were more, many, but four are the ones that are more known. First one, the Argentinian Julio Cortázar. He wrote Hopscotch. In Spanish, we call it Rayuela, and he is like experimenting a lot with. There are many ways to read that novel. You can go like from chapter 1 to the end, or you can jump. You can be jumping from one chapter to the other, and he gives you a suggestion, the writer, but you can create your own novel when you read it. Okay, so you participate in the creation of the plot. The other one is La Ciudad y los Perros of the Peruvian Mario Vargas Llosa. So we know Lima, we know young characters from Lima, and that is a very important novel. And then we have the Mexican Carlos Fuentes, who wrote The Death of Artemio Cruz, and it was basically about the post-revolutionary Mexico. And he also experimented a lot because he tells the plot in first person, second person, and third person. He's playing with the perspective, the point of view of the narrator. So you have to be very attentive when you are reading that novel. But it is about the post-revolutionary Mexico. That is number 3. Number 4, the most well-known novel in Latin America ever, and that is the Colombian Gabriel García Márquez and his novel Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude. And to me, 100 Years of Solitude is like he is inventing basically the origins of Latin America. He's like creating this new land, Macondo, that people moved there in order to establish a new town, but it is basically like a some genetic, like a Bible, but in this new land. So you don't know when the gypsies arrive, the Africans arrive, but everybody's arriving to that town. That town is life is coming out, it's blooming. I would say that the beauty of the way he writes is very pleasant. You experience something pleasant when you are reading it. So verbally, there is something there, and you keep reading. So there were more writers from all over, but those are the four most well known.
And he's known as creating the musical surrealism when it comes to the Latin American literature. But there is a period we call the after boom. What were the characteristics of the after boom?
Well, we had a problem after the boom because and some of the writers didn't like the word boom. They have their own reasons. But we had a problem with the post-boom writers because those 20 or 30 or 40 writers that were very famous from the boom, they created amazing pieces of literature. And then we wanted to write like them. Everybody wanted to write to imitate them.
Copy.
And we did it already, like in Colombia, who is going to write better Gabriel García Márquez was who knows. So for decades, the only writer in Colombia was Gabriel García Márquez. There were more, of course, but
Okay.
people didn't want to hear about the others. They wanted to hear about Gabriel García Márquez. The same with Carlos Fuentes or Vargas Llosa or Julio Cortázar. So they face this problem that how do we talk about this moment in Latin America, but also in a new way,
Yeah. Mm.
with a different structure, proposing a new, a new way to create a novel, okay, with different voices and to experiment, but in another manner. So I would say with the post boom there was some a movement that was called the crack. I particularly like some of those stories, but no, to me the boom is reach very high levels.
Mm.
Uh, well, we have Isabel Allende, maybe that is your question, no? You have a question about Isabel Allende, but to me, Isabel Allende is a part of the boom.
Yeah.
She's in the boom in terms of the time when she published The House of the Spirits, and there's her style, her style.
Mm.
But there are new writers. Yeah, we can talk about new writers already from this century. I don't know if you want to.
Mm. But by talking about Isabel Allende and his book, The House of the Spirit, you are acknowledging that women were part of the boom and they did participate. Can you tell us a little bit about her and that book and women who really affected that period of boom or the history of Latin American literature?
Well, to talk about magical realism, because we connect magical realism with her and with Gabriel Garcia Marquez. There are some critics that don't like the term, but let's say it is like, how would I explain what it is? It is like you see supernatural things that take it as a daily event, like nothing happens. Like, for example, there is a moment in 100 Years of Solitude when Remedios La Bella, she goes out to hang the clothes that she just washed. And she said, okay, now I think it's time for me to go. And just like that, she levitated and went to heaven.
Mm.
And the family, they kept talking, oh, Remedios, yeah, she went to heaven already. But they don't say that she died of a heart attack or insinuating anything. No, she just went up there. With Isabel Allende, I remember that there was the father of the family that lived with that person died, and they lived with the skull under the bed, and they were praying. It became like a soccer ball, the skull of the father, because they wanted to have him there, and it was like a common thing, something that one might see as, what is that? Why do you have a skull in the house and children play with it? And they take it as a normal thing. So things that are like, either supernatural or uncommon, you take it as a daily event. And Isabel Allende is the most well-known writer of that period, but there were others. And I think we didn't pay attention to them. They wrote beautiful pieces of literature, and until now, we are paying attention to them, with the exception of Isabel Allende. Isabel Allende, I think people read her novels since the early 1980s. But there were women that participated in that movement called the boom, and people in Argentina, Luisa Valenzuela, people in Mexico, Elena Garro, and now we are reading their pieces. They were contemporary of Garcia Marquez, Carlos Fuentes, but I think was very, very male-oriented.
Mm. We know also that George Luis Borges thought story did affect the Latin American culture. Can you tell us about him a little bit and how his writing affects generations of Latin Americans?
Yes, so probably Garcia Marquez is the most important Latin American writer. Not the most well known, but to me, he's the most important one. Everything that he wrote is very philosophical, very precise, and at the same time beautiful. It's beautiful. We have to read their stories 10 or eight times in order to get it. But
Mm.
once you get it, it accompanies you forever and it opens your eyes. So he was very important. He belongs to the generation previous to the boom, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, before the Cuban Revolution, but he became well known with the boom. So the boom helped writers from previous periods because, and then people in the world started to pay attention to writers like Borges. And I think he is probably the most influential Latin American writer in other parts of the world because they say, okay, let me illustrate what immortality is. Oh, like Borges in this story. Let me illustrate what being, what God, how can we illustrate when you become a little God in this moment. And then there is the Aleph. You see that there is a person, a character that goes to his basement and he sees like a little marble there with light and he sees everything that is happening at this very moment in the world. Oh my God, what is that? And then there is the story of the Aleph. It's called Aleph. And then you say, if I am able to see everything that is happening in the world at this very moment, well, I am like God. So, and that is what is happening with this character. So he has these stories that are no longer than 5 pages because he never wrote a novel.
Mm.
So short stories, a poem. Okay, and then you say, oh my God, now I have an idea of being a God through this short story. Okay, he's in everything and he's in the present everywhere. Okay. So he has many stories that are very philosophical, beautiful, and, and illustrative, I would say.
He's from where? Mexico or like Argentina? Or?
He's from Argentina,
Mm.
very interesting character because he grew up speaking English in his own house.
Mm.
He came from in a very intellectual family. He was living with his mother until his whole life. He didn't have children. At the end, he had a dilemma: who am I going to inherit what we have? And I think he got married with his secretary just to inherit somebody. He passed in Geneva, in Switzerland. He passed there. He is buried in Geneva, Switzerland. And he was conservative in terms of politics. He was conservative. We criticize Borges because he received an award from Augusto Pinochet in Chile when a moment that was very difficult. And he went there and we said, oh my God, why is he doing this? But yeah, right now I would say he has a lot of value. His literature has a lot of value. And
Yeah,
he loved Buenos Aires. He felt very Argentinian and he wrote a lot about Argentina.
yeah. It's one of the questions I wanted to ask, but you already answered it because I feel like Latin America has been in that struggle since after independence between the liberal and the conservatives. And Márquez, Gabriel is viewed a little bit as a liberal, and there are authors also who are viewed as conservative, and that struggle is still there, where people can be defined as a liberal or conservative based on their writing. However, can you, we went through the period, we all, me as Africans, I fell in love with the Latin American literatures. That mean that authors, through their writing, did influence the world. And what, based on your view, what is the impact of Latin American authors and their writing around the world?
Well, many impacts, but there is one writer that we didn't mention.
Mm,
Is contemporary of Borges. That means before the boom.
okay.
But he is still very read. People read by his books.
Mm,
His name is Juan Rulfo. Rulfo is from Mexico, and he only wrote two books, one of short stories and one novel. And yes, he created an impact in Europe too.
mm,
He and I think the main contribution of Rulfo is that he describes the life of peasants in the countryside of Mexico.
mm,
He sees that there is a lot of richness there, spiritual, a lot of spirituality, a lot of how can I say it, like even philosophical aspects, the relationship they have with the land, with and they are poor, very poor people in his novel, but and he's very also like very precise. Sometimes we compare Rulfo with Garcia Marquez, both are amazing, but Rulfo has sentences of 8 words. He's like very poo 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 poo, and
mm,
Garcia Marquez his sentences are very long.
mm.
You dance with them, okay? So I think that was a big impact of you. We can talk about there is a lot of richness in the life of poor people in the countryside.
I
Of
see.
course, what else? I think these dynamics that make unique Latin America, the dynamics of the people from different cultural backgrounds. So we have people who come with more African roots, indigenous roots, European roots. And those dynamics sometimes are very difficult. In the same family, we have different color of skin, and we discriminate each other, but we love each other. And how does it happen? And I think that's very unique in Latin America because of our history.
I
Yeah.
see. We must also acknowledge that the development of technology, such as printing and the art of translating, because personally I don't speak Spanish. However, I was able to read those books through translations. How the printings, the translation of these books participate on creating a well-known Latin American literature around the world.
Well, that was very important, especially with the boom. With the boom, I would say the original piece of 100 Years of Solitude in Spanish is as recommended as the translation in English.
Mhm.
People talk about that translation that was made by Gregory Rabassa, that's the name of the translator, and they say, oh my God. So they talk about the translator as if he were the author of that piece, and I think he deserves a lot of credit for the translation.
Mhm.
So the translators became very important in Latin American literature. especially with the boom of the narrative, the Latin American narrative. So we know other famous translators of other pieces. The same Octavio Paz was a translator, and so we get to know their pieces because of people who professionalize in this new profession of being a translator into this new into this other language. So yes. Now I don't know if we should talk a little bit about the new trends in Latin American literature, Alpha, or if you have any other question.
Yeah, I'm coming to that because you mentioned a very important fact, which is real, that you emphasize the borders in the early colonial era, and at certain point you stated that those borders did evolve even into the United States. And the reason behind it is based on the population. We have a huge Latin American community living in the United States, and that community are living different realities that doesn't reflect the reality of the booms and things. And one of the topic is the immigration. So how you as writers and playwrights, how are you dealing with that new reality, um, um, immigration issues, and how you writing about it, and what is your thought about that emerging issue?
Well, before we jump to the United States, I would say that in Latin America, nowadays, the most important writers are women.
Okay.
Women, and with the topics of women too. Okay, feminism or different types of feminism, different situations, but what I have read, and I said this is a new voice, are basically female. Yeah. In Argentina, in Colombia, Ecuador, in Mexico, those are the ones that are like capturing this new reality, which is very difficult, very violent, but the ones that are telling the stories about right now are women, basically.
Can you name few of them and
Yeah,
their work?
probably the most well known is Cristina Rivera Garza. Cristina Rivera Garza is from northern Mexico, but actually she's living in Texas right now. Cristina Rivera Garza. And I think it's his last novel, the summer of or I don't remember, the summer de Viviana, the summer of Viviana. And Cristina Rivera Garza tells the story. I haven't read the novel, and I want to read it. I know that she describes her sister was captured, was kidnapped, and she was killed in a horrible feminicide in Mexico. And that is the story of her own sister, of Cristina Rivera Garza. And she's at this very moment, she's a candidate to receive the Nobel Prize of Literature. Who knows? Tomorrow they are going to announce who's the winner.
Okay.
Okay, but she is the Latin American candidate right now.
Okay.
She is a new voice, and there are many young writers in their 30s, in their 40s, even 20s. Okay, so I have the names, but not fresh right here.
It's okay.
So so if we move to the United States, I would say that there is a movement that is beginning to emerge, to write, to novelize, to write novels, short stories, about the lives of Latinos in Miami, in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles. It's something new.
Okay.
Okay, it's like an infant literature at this very stage because we came here to work. That was the only objective we had when we came. We came to work. Well, we didn't come to read or we didn't come to write novels, but we ended up staying here. And I said, I have time. I want to tell what is happening right now. And I would say that there are many stories waiting for
Be
the
told. Mm.
writer to be told. Many, many. And I'm very rich because over here I came to know people from Mexico, from other part of Mexico that I haven't met. I hadn't met anybody from Tabasco in my hometown. I came to know them here, and not also that. I had Peruvian friends. I had friends from Senegal. His name is Alpha. Yeah. I have friends from Japan. So these
Mm.
dynamics, or we work with different people, and
Mm.
but it hasn't been. It is about. It is beginning to be told
I
this
see.
in Spanish.
I see.
Okay, and very important here is the how the tool that we have is the language, and this Spanish that we speak over here goes through a change, a
Mm.
daily change, because we keep adding new words to our language
Mm.
that probably people in Mexico doesn't know, don't
Yeah.
know, they know, and what we call Spanglish. I think the
Okay.
literature that
Spanish.
we write over here is going to be written in Spanglish.
I see. Right now, you have a play on productions, and is playing right now. You don't mind telling us about your play? What is the title? What it is about, and why you decided to write about the story and the production? Can you tell us a little bit about your play?
Yeah, I used to write short stories, and at certain moment, moved from writing short stories to writing plays.
Okay.
Plays about immigrants, not necessarily Mexican or Latin American immigrants in general. And most of the time are in Spanish. Many times they are bilingual, like Dulce, the one that we are presenting right now. In the year 2010, I founded a local theater group called
Okay.
Colectivo El Pozo. And I would say that the
What does that mean? Collectivo del Pozo.
collective and pozo means well, a well.
Okay.
And there is a novel that I like, a Uruguayan novel that I like a lot, that is called El Pozo, the Well. A very short novel, written in the 1930s, and
Okay.
it was a homage to that novel, a homage. And so Dulce is also about the second generation of Mexican family. They came, and Latinos or Mexican families, we are hybrids.
Mhm.
We have people who are citizens that
Okay.
are volunteers, we have people who are permanent residents, and we have people that are in a very vulnerable situation many times, including myself.
Mhm.
In a vulnerable situation, that's why what is happening right now with President Trump, we are horrified. We're like, what can happen to our relatives? Yeah, because we are in this situation. So in the play Dulce, there is a family, a mother that lives with his two daughters, and one of them who is a citizen, American-born citizen. The other one is a dreamer, a DACA recipient.
Mhm.
But the citizen decides to give her citizenship papers to his best friend that happens to be undocumented.
Mhm.
I said, now, from now on, you are going to be me, and I am going to be you. The best friend says, that's crazy. How can that be? Yes, why not? So I think it starts like that's something that came to her mind, but it builds up more and more and more and more. And what is she giving? What did she see in order to give away her papers? It's a sacrifice, an act of sacrifice, basically, that she's doing. So it evolves. The story evolves about that. Around yeah,
paper issue. If
yeah.
somebody wanna see the play, before that, what is the meaning of the name? To listen.
Yeah, well, that is the literature part because dulce comes from Dulcinea in Don Quixote, the
Mm,
famous novel from Spain. Don Quixote was in love with Dulcinea. So
okay.
characters in the play, they are young people that are in the last year in the high school, and they read an excerpt of Don Quixote, and she decided to be like Dulcinea, to fall in love with a man like that, because that was a crazy, wise man, Don Quixote, and she
Mm,
wanted to be with him.
mm,
So she goes up to the attic every day, and one day she talks with Don Quixote,
I
and, and,
see.
and she decides to go back to go to the school, and that morning she decides to give away her citizenship to her best friend because that's something that Don Quixote would have done.
I see.
And
If I have understanding as usual, because I did have the chance to see your previous plays, there are always subtitles, if I'm not mistaken, even though most of the narrative is Spanish, but there are English subtitles, so people who don't understand English can um, understand what is happening. So, what is the duration of the play? And if one people want to see it, where should they go? Mm.
well, I recommend a review that was published yesterday in the Chicago Reader about the play. It's
Chicago Reader. Okay.
Chicago Reader, they publish a review. And we are running this a play from until October 26th.
Okay.
That
Mm.
is Thursday, Friday, Saturday at 7:30,
Okay.
Sunday at 3 p.m.
Mm.
3 p.m. And we are presenting it at Rivendell Theater. Rivendell Theater located at 5779 North Ridge Avenue.
I see.
5779 North Ridge Avenue in Edgewater.
And is there a website they can go visit?
You can visit the Rivendell Theater. They have it there. If not, visit our Facebook page of Colectivo El Pozo. We have all the information there. Colectivo El Pozo.
Professor Raul, again, thank you very much for taking your time and sharing your knowledge about your community, about the Latin American literature. I really appreciate having you under the human right plea, and I hope people also um, go see the play to better understand the new reality of the Latin American community in the United States of America. Again, thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Alpha. It is very nice to talk to you and see you again.
Muchas gracias.